Hi there, my name is Jennifer. I'm a naturalist with the City of Aurora's Open Space Natural Resource Division here in Aurora, Colorado. I'm very excited that you have chosen to continue to embark on these education videos with me in part of our Discovering Aurora's True Nature virtual video series. If you haven't already, be sure to check out those pre-questions that were either sent to you from your teacher or you can read and click on in the description link of this video. These questions are meant to help us get thinking about our topic today, which is plants and habitats. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking all about plants and habitats. What's a habitat? Well, a habitat is simply a place where a plant and animal lives and can get all their basic needs met. Do you guys remember what plants need to grow? That's right. Plants need water, sunlight, air, and nutrients from the soil to be able to grow. They also need physical growing space. So all those things go into making up a plant's habitat. Now, for animals, their habitat where they live consists of being able to find food, water, and shelter so that they can survive. Where and how plants grow is largely determined by the environmental conditions of that place. But as we'll soon learn, plants play a huge role in helping to shape their environment and create important habitat for animals. Can you guys think of a few different types of habitats that occur around the globe? I'll give you a few seconds to brainstorm. So what did you come up with? Some of the more common habitats that people tend to think of are deserts, oceans, forests, and the Arctic. Did you ever wonder why certain plants and animals only live in certain areas? Well, a big part of it has to do with climate, or the weather patterns of a place. Whether an area is hot or cold, or wet or dry, is a huge factor in determining what types of plants and animals can grow and survive in that place. You would never expect to see a palm tree growing in the Arctic or a polar bear able to survive in the desert, would you? No, absolutely not. And that's because different plants and animals are suited to living in different types of habitat conditions. To show you a little bit about what I mean, we're going to go on a habitat walk adventure in one of my favorite habitat types here in Aurora, a prairie. We're going to be looking for cool and fascinating ways in which the plants growing in this somewhat harsh environment are able to survive, and some of the animals that depend on these plants for their survival. So come on, let's go on an adventure. All right, so here we are starting out our prairie adventure in the prairie here at the Plains Conservation Center in Aurora, Colorado. What's a prairie, you might ask? Well, a prairie is a type of grassland, basically a relatively flat expanse of land with no trees, where grasses and wildflowers dominate. This is one of my favorite types of habitats because as Coloradans, we're extremely lucky to have this endangered ecosystem, the shortgrass steppe prairie, here right near our own backyards. Now the prairie is characterized by a lack of water, windy conditions, extreme temperatures, the presence of fire, as well as grazing animals, like the pronghorn you see in the distance grazing on grass. How do prairie plants actually survive these somewhat harsh conditions and pressures? Well, we're going to take an in-depth look as we go and explore the prairie. So remember inside when we were talking about how different habitats have different non-living parts of that environment that influence or determine which sorts of plants and animals can live there? Well, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the prairie habitat and talking about the non-living parts that influence that environment and how some of the plants are able to survive there. So in order to do that, we first need to introduce the term adaptations. Now in this instance, adaptations is what plants do with either having different structures or different characteristics about the plant that allow them to survive or thrive in that place. So let's go hunting for some different prairie plant adaptations by first discussing some of the non-living parts of that habitat or that environment. And the first one I want to talk about is water. water in prairie and grassland ecosystems around the globe is typically scarce. There's not very much of it in these types of habitats. In fact, in eastern Colorado, where the shortgrass prairie habitat occurs, we receive only about 12 to 16 inches of precipitation. That's rainfall or snow that falls from the sky within a given year. So what does that look like? Well, here I have a tube that's about 1 inch diameter, that's 12 inches in length. And so this is going to be our measured amount of 12 inches of water, representing the 12 inches of annual precipitation that this habitat might get in a given year. So I'm going to go ahead and measure this out. All right. Oh, I spilt a teeny bit. The prairie's going to get a little bit of extra water in that patch. So this is the amount of 12 inches, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in this bucket, and then we'll pause the video and show you what it looks like, just so you can get a visual for how much water 12 inches really is. Here we go. So here's our bucket, and this is what the water of the 12 inches of precipitation looks like. Can you guys see inside there? It's not very much water, really. Would it be enough water for you guys to brush your teeth in the morning, or to take a shower, or maybe to do a load of laundry? Probably not. But this is the amount of water that the prairie plants have to survive within 1 year of the prairie. So one of the ways that prairie plants can conserve water in this dry habitat is by having long, slender, thin leaves. Now these long, skinny leaves help to conserve water in two ways. One, instead of having a big, fat, round leaf, like maybe a plant might in the rainforest where they get a lot of water but not so much sunlight, they have these thin, skinny leaves that don't have as much surface area, and therefore not as much water loss occurs in the stomata of the plant, those tiny pores that we learned about in the build-a-plant activity that exchange air and water through the leaf surface. So by having long, skinny leaves, this helps the plant to conserve water in this really dry environment that has a lot of sunlight. So another way in which prairie plants have adapted to conserving water doesn't have to do with the above ground part of the plant that we see. It has to do with the below ground part of the plant that we don't see. To illustrate what I mean, I want to talk up first about this plant here. This grass is called blue Grama, and it happens to be our state grass. It's all dried up and dead now, but the seed heads look a little bit like eyelashes. And during the peak of its growing season, this plant only gets to be about 8, maybe 12 inches high. So just about this tall here with this green rope. But the below ground part of the plant is truly massive. These are the roots, and look, they're taller than me. And these roots of the plant are really important for helping the plant to seek out and find any little bit of moisture that might be underground and conserve it and use it for the plant during dry times. The other really important part of these roots is they help to anchor the plant into the ground. And of course, gather nutrients from the soil. All right, so this is a diagram helping to illustrate what we're talking about with these really deep root systems that prairie plants have. You can see here there's a number of different grasses and flowers that are growing in the prairie, all different types of prairie plants, and they have really, really massive deep root systems, some up to 15 feet or more. So these root systems are really important to help the plant in conserving water. So we just learned that prairies don't get a lot of water, and therefore they can't support things like trees, because trees need a lot of water to grow. So therefore, because this landscape doesn't have any big structures like trees sticking up out of the ground to serve as windbreaks, winds can move very strongly across this landscape, and so there's a lot of wind here. So that brings about the next non-living part that we want to discuss here, and that is wind and how plants adapt to living in this windy habitat. And one of the ways, again, has to do with these plants having flexible or bendy parts above the ground that allow them to easily bend over and blow in the wind, instead of having like a woody tree branch that could break off in really strong winds. So this is one way in which plants have adapted to living in strong windy conditions. Another one that we talked about in our earlier video when we learned about how seeds move around in the environment has to do with their seeds. Most all the prairie plants that grow in the prairie, they move their seeds about by wind dispersal. So another type of habitat condition prevalent in prairies is extreme temperatures. During the summertime, temperatures can reach up to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and over the course of the winter they can drop below freezing. So how do plants adapt to these extreme fluctuations in temperature? Well, one way that plants can tolerate extreme heat is by having lightly colored or almost silvery or even like a dusting over their leaf surfaces, a gray dusting, and as in the course of this plant called fringed sage. You can see last year's growth here that's kind of died off, but the new growth's coming through, and it is a lightly colored, like a grayish green sage color. And this allows the plants to reflect more light and stay cooler, and also not lose as much water in this dry environment. Another way that prairie plants can survive the long cold winters is the above ground parts of the plant can go dormant or go to sleep, but the below ground part in their roots is still very much alive and growing. And then so over the course of the growing season, the grasses and plants are green, and towards the end of the growing season they start to die off and look like this brown color. And this brown dead plant material allows for fire to readily move through the landscape and burn off the dead old growth of the plant. And so how can plants survive fire, burning the tips of them? One way is that instead of having their growing tips placed at the top or the tip of the plant, like many trees do, grasses and a lot of prairie plants have their growing tips down near the base of the plant or even underground. So we can see here's last year's growth of all this dead grass, but we have a few green new grass shoots coming up at the first signs of spring. And here we have what is where the meristem or the growing point of the plant occurs. You can see it's at the base of the plant, or even sometimes below the ground. And that's how the plant survives the top portion of it being burnt from things like fire. So we've talked about 4 non-living parts of the prairie habitat that are present: lack of water, a lot of wind, extreme temperatures, and the presence of fire, and how prairie plants adapt to these different non-living parts of the habitat. Now we're going to take a look at how prairie plants play an important role in creating important habitat for animals and how they are able to survive there. So the prairie ecosystem produces a lot of grass, and so there's a lot of grass for grazing animals to eat. So historically, large grazers like bison used to graze the prairie in large numbers. We still have at the Plains Conservation Center pronghorn and things like prairie dogs that also still graze on the grass. And one way that plants are able to adapt to being trampled on or walked on or eaten, again, has to do with their growth tips being low to the ground or below the ground. So again, those meristems being positioned at the base of the plant rather than the top. So when a bison or a pronghorn or a prairie dog comes and clips the top of the plant, it's able to regrow and resprout new leaves and shoots. In fact, prairie grasses and plants actually need things like fire and grazing to remove all the dead plants of the parts so the new part of the plant can grow and rejuvenate. So now we're going to be talking about plants that have adapted ways to keep from being eaten by animals. And one way is this cactus here that has these sharp spines that are very pokey and would stick in and hurt something that would brush up against it or get too close or try to eat it. So that's one way that this plant has adapted to keep from being eaten. Another plant happens to be this yucca plant behind it. It also has long, sharp, slender leaves that would poke you and hurt you if you touch them. But I do notice, if I look closely, a couple of the leaves over here look like some sort of animal has eaten them. Can you guys brainstorm and think about any sorts of animals that live in the prairie that could actually eat yucca? I'll leave you with it and we'll talk about it when we get inside. So I'm curious what you guys thought about when you were thinking about the type of animal that could have eaten that yucca plant that was growing out in the prairie. Did you guys think about birds like this western meadowlark that's actually sitting on the seed stalk of the yucca plant here in the picture? Or maybe you thought it could have been these little guys, these prairie dogs here in the foreground of the prairie that live underground and eat grasses and things in the prairie. Well, actually, the answer lies in these larger herbivores or grazers called pronghorn, which are sometimes mistakenly referred to as antelope. Now, pronghorn are actually not related to antelope, but more closely related to giraffes in Africa. Now, giraffes can eat sharp, thorny acacia trees in Africa and not injure or hurt their mouths. And pronghorn are very similar in that they can eat the yucca plants without damaging or hurting their mouths. And they will mainly do this in times when water is very scarce, like in a time of drought, so that they can get some extra water from the plant. But the fact that they're able to do this is an amazing adaptation that these prairie animals have developed to be able to survive in this harsh climate. Let's talk about some other prairie animals now. Now, I can't very well talk about prairies and grazing animals without talking about these big beasties, the American bison, sometimes incorrectly referred to as the buffalo. Now, these large grazing animals, much like the pronghorn, depend upon the grasses and the wildflowers that grow in the prairie for their food. So much so that the bison have to eat up to 25 pounds of forage a day to sustain their body mass. Now, that's a lot of grass. Another way in which bison have adapted to be able to survive in the prairie environment is by having thick fur and hides that allow them to stay warm and survive the harsh prairie winters. Sadly, these bison nearly went extinct, so we no longer have them in places like the Plains Conservation Center, but you can see them in places where they've been reintroduced and are making a comeback, the closest of which in the Denver metro area is that at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal Wildlife Refuge in northeast Denver, just north of Stapleton. Another key animal that plays a really important role in helping to shape the prairie habitat are these little critters, prairie dogs, who not only eat the above ground grasses and wildflowers that grow in the prairie, but they also dig extensive burrows and chambers underneath the ground to get out of the extreme temperatures that we've learned about that can exist in the prairie environment. So prairie dogs get their food needs met from the plants, but did you know they also get their water needs met from the prairie plants as well? That's right, prairie dogs don't have to go to a nearby stream or pond and drink from the surface water there. They can get all their water needs met from the prairie plants that they eat. Now that's definitely an amazing adaptation. Another way in which prairie dogs depend on the plants that grow in their habitat has to do with those deep root systems we talked about earlier. Anytime a prairie plant dies and its root system dies, those roots start to break down and decompose underground, and eventually over time they build soil. And these deep prairie soils make for good conditions for prairie dogs to dig in and build extensive
tunnels underground. So much so that sometimes their burrows have been documented to go as deep as 20 feet deep and just as extensive wide. So these are just some of the ways in which prairie animals depend on the plants that grow in the prairie environment for their food, water, and shelter needs.
Thanks so much for tuning in with me today as we've learned a little bit more about Aurora plants and habitats. We've talked a little bit not only about how the environmental conditions of a place determine what types of plants can grow there and how, but also how plants themselves play a big role in shaping the environment and creating important habitat for the animals that live there. I encourage you now to go outside in your own backyards and greenways and open space and look for different plants and animals living there. Can you find some interesting ways in which these plants and animals have adapted to the growing conditions of that place? Don't forget to also take a sneak peek at the post-video questions associated with this video to discover what you've learned today. I look forward to hopefully seeing you again soon in another one of our Discovering Aurora's True Nature education videos. Bye for now.